It is a shockingly graphic story of betrayal and torture. The latest in a trio of defendants has just been sentenced to prison for her role in a brutal child abuse case. We're analyzing the details with Alyssa, an expert on how predators target kids. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 20-year-old Maria Evans will spend the next 2 decades in prison after she pled guilty to a reduced charge of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury. Evans was one of 3 defendants charged in this Cook County, Texas case. One, 38-year-old David Calhoun, was convicted in March on various assault charges and sentenced to 10 life sentences. The third defendant in this case, David's wife Ashley, is due back in court next month. Now, a lot of this alleged abuse that we're about to get into, revealed during Calhoun's trial, is just too graphic to get into. I am telling you, it is so horrific. I'm confident to say this is the worst case of child abuse I have ever seen, I have ever covered. To give you an idea of this, Pamela Miller, who's a senior policy analyst with an institute that advocates for child abuse victims, labeled the abuse as, quote, intrafamilial child torture, saying it was almost indistinguishable from the type of torture that POWs, prisoners of war, and political prisoners suffered during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, except here we're talking about children. According to prosecutors, Calhoun inflicted brutal abuse on several kids, stepchildren, nephews, inside of a fifth-wheel trailer. Court documents say the abuse started in 2017 after Calhoun started caring for his nephews. Caring is in quotations there. And 5 years later, in 2022, investigators found Calhoun's 16-year-old nephew in a Nebraska hotel room with several unrelated adults. The boy told police he'd escaped a home where he'd suffered severely. He showed them scars across his body, gave detailed accounts of being tied up for days, set on fire, burned, beaten, stabbed, and honestly, I think a word that I could use here that's appropriate, mutilated with objects. Again, I don't want to get into it more. It is nauseating. I physically got nauseous when I was reading what was going on here. And investigators later found multiple other victims. Calhoun's wife, Ashley, and Maria Evans, they are accused of participating in the torture of these children. Both Ashley and Maria, they testified against Calhoun during his trial. Maria says Calhoun started grooming her when she was 17 years old and that he forced her to abuse the children. She claimed she was in fear for her life, and she did what she was told. Ashley testified that her husband forced her to have sex with a minor that was involved in this case. Jurors were also shown a picture of carvings on Ashley's chest that were done by Calhoun with a pen. We are talking sick stuff here. And as part of her plea deal, Maria pled guilty to that reduced charge of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison. No word yet on when Ashley Calhoun will head to trial or if she'll take a plea, but again, she's expected in court. I want to bring in licensed clinical social worker Alyssa, who wrote the book Duck, Duck, Groom, Understanding How a Child Becomes a Target. Anna, thanks for coming on. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is this idea of Maria claiming that she was groomed to abuse, that she had no choice, and she was put in a position where she was coerced to abuse these children. What were your thoughts on that aspect of the story?
Well, Jesse, thank you for having me on the show today to discuss such an important topic. As you've already pointed out, these are heinous crimes, and the focus really needs to be on the well-being of these children moving forward. It is through their bravery and their courage that we're even facing this case to begin with. So thank you to those victims for standing up and coming forward with their stories. I think Maria's situation is very unique, and we have more that we will hopefully learn about her situation. It is not uncommon that male sexual predators and abusive individuals will go out of their way to recruit, especially females. What do we know about females? Females are usually almost a protected class in and of themselves. People perceive women to be caregiving, kind, generous, and tender, typically. So in this case, it would not surprise me if Maria was in fact groomed by not just David, but possibly David and Ashley.
Hey, I want to take a quick sidebar from Sidebar to tell you guys about Wondery's awesome podcast, American Scandal. You can listen right now and explore the biggest political corruption scheme in U.S. history. Using vivid and immersive storytelling, American Scandal retraces the bribes, players, and underhanded deals related to the Teapot Dome scandal. In 1922, newspapers reported that Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall had leased federally owned oil reserves to two of the nation's wealthiest oil barons, Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair. Fall had made the deals to enrich himself, and all three men were charged with defrauding the U.S. government. The scandal, named after one of the oil reserves in Wyoming, would eventually send Sinclair to prison for contempt of Congress and jury tampering, and made Fall the first person ever convicted of a crime committed while serving in the U.S. cabinet. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge this season, American Scandal Teapot Dome, early and ad-free right now at wondery.fm/LC Sidebar. I didn't even get into what Maria was accused of doing because it's honestly, I don't want to say it. It's so sadistic and horrifying. I couldn't believe what I was reading. But someone would look at this and say, I don't buy it. How could she not call the police? How could she not escape? How could she not get out of that situation? What does it mean? Unless he had a gun to her head and forced her to do it, I don't believe it. What would you say to that?
So I think we need to back up a second and talk about the greater grooming process. So grooming is a perverse form of courtship, and it includes what I describe as the 4 F's. Those 4 F's are flattery, favoritism, forbidden fruits, and fear. And it's likely that Maria was in deep into the fear stage at the time that these expectations were placed on her by David and possibly even Ashley as well. So during the fear stage, this is when the predator will do things like threaten the individual and say, you're not ever going to go home unless you do these things. I'm going to release all this information about you if you don't do these things, if you don't comply. And one thing I really want to make clear, especially to your audience, is that grooming begins very sweetly. It doesn't start out this way. So it would be interesting. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how Maria even got into the life of David and Ashley. How did she meet these two? Was she a contact through the children? Was she a contact maybe in the local area or in the neighborhood? Because predators need access. And as I'm sure we'll get into this during this conversation, David had isolation in spades with these children, with his stepchildren and his nephews living in the house with him. And we already know that the house is the highest risk area, the highest risk location for all child sexual abuse. 82% of the time, child sexual abuse is going to occur in the home where the child lives or the home where the predator lives. And this case is a great display of that.
So, and I'll also add to that in the sense that if Ashley's watching David Calhoun doing these incredibly violent and sadistic things to children, there is an argument both put by her and Ashley Calhoun that they were in fear for their life. But again, people will look at this, they will hear this, they will blame them equally for what happened to these children. And I honestly can't fault them. I hear what you're saying and I hear what happens, but it's just difficult to try to understand the reasoning by why they did it. But I want to talk about David now and what he, forced them to do. This is the worst abuse I've ever seen, I've ever read about. What were your thoughts when you were reading this?
Jesse, I was aghast at what I read that David, Ashley, and Maria put those children through. in that trailer. The scene that I was conjuring in my head is just pales in comparison to the torture that those children endured. And you brought up something earlier that I think we need to pull out as a special hallmark as well in this case, is that this is not the first time that David was abusing children. If anything, there are probably several more victims, and it's already been revealed that there were cases in East Texas in which children were abused at his hand. And what we have to remember about predators is that they are chronic offenders. These are not one-time off instances. These individuals typically, 70% of the time, have up to 9 victims, and 20% of the time they have up to 20 victims. Now, we don't know for sure how many victims in total David has, but this is an opportunity for your listeners to keep in mind that individuals they come in contact with, or that come in contact with their children who are seeking out isolation, seeking out time away from other secure adults or safe adults, from observation, from the sight of others, that those are really, really big red flags that we all need to pay attention to as parents and as caregivers. In this scenario, you have him as a caregiver. One of the things I want your audience to keep in mind, Jesse, is that we need and rely on other adults all the time for the well-being of our families and our children. So what do I mean by that? I mean that part of the role that schools play is checking on children. Are they showing up? Are they showing up on time? Are they showing up fed? Are they showing up clothed properly? Are they showing up with any signs of ailment, illness, or abuse? Schools are one of our greatest catch basins for abuse. So, for example, teachers might be able to alert a family or a school social worker or a school counselor if they see the presence of bruising, or if they see presence of a child who has really spotty attendance. And I'd be curious in this case if these children, these 4 individuals, ages 10 to 16, those are all ages in which children are required to attend school up until age 16, at least in the state where I live. So what other sort of oversight did these children have, and who's dropped the ball here? Was social services ever called? Was the Department of Family and Children's Services ever called? Because this abuse lasted since 2017. That is a 5-year span that we know of where 4 children, 4 harmless children were victimized in their own home by somebody who was given legal authority to have custody of them. So I think there is more to be investigated here, especially when it comes to the Department of Family and Children's Services and what was not done and how these children were failed.
Let me ask you about that. In terms of abusers in your practice, if you're talking about someone abusing not necessarily their own biological children, but here their stepchildren or nephews, is that, as we're trying to understand why someone would do this, do you see the rationale different? Do you see it more with an abuser abusing people who are within their family, but they're not direct children, versus to stepchildren or nephews? Again, there's no excuse, there's no justification, but I'm trying to understand why somebody would do this. And does it have something to do with that relationship between him and these kids?
Well, you've raised a really interesting point, which is he had unlimited access because these children were living in his home. So what we have to consider is that we don't know the biological connection with these children. So it is protective, typically. Abuse does occur by biological parents and incest does occur, but that is on the lower end of likelihood than individuals who are boyfriends to a parent who has minor children or lovers of somebody who has minor children in the home, because there is no biological protection. There is nothing that says, you're part of me and so therefore I'm going to protect you. We see this all the time in the animal kingdom, for example. When a female picks a new male, typically one of the things that will happen is that the offspring from prior connections will be killed. So in a way, we see this sort of playing out in human relationships. One of the things we have to keep in mind, though, is that there is no justification whatsoever for any sort of harm or abuse to children. And children are never at fault for this situation or being survivors of abuse. And in this case, we have multiple adults who failed to recognize.
But here's what I would say. I'd say, the two women in this case, they would say, "Oh, I was under the influence, the fear of Daniel Calhoun." If you interview Daniel Calhoun, what would he say? What would be his justification for this? Assuming he admits it. But in your experience, why do they justify it? How do they explain it?
Oh, well, I think if you did a deep dive into David's childhood, his upbringing, maybe his initial relationships, any of those early foundational relationships that he had, you would probably see a tremendous amount of instability. You might see domestic violence. You might see substance abuse. We also don't know what role substances played inside this house. If there were substances being used on a regular basis that may have been at play when these torturous acts were being done to these children. And one of the things I like to focus on is we don't understand why people do these things. We have some ideas, and the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, ATSA.org, is a wonderful site for people to go to get more information about the research that's done on sexual predators. But one of the things we need to do as caring adults and parents is we need to think about how this is done, because we're not going to change individuals who are coming in contact with our children, but we can change the way that we present ourselves and create a strategy, an offensive strategy, in order to protect our own families and children.
And you know what else? I didn't even mention this. The idea of, and by the way, that was incredibly well said, and I think a really very important point taken. But he not only forced these women to abuse these children, he forced the children to participate in it. There was one instance that I read about where he forced one of the children to extract the tooth out of another child. And so in your experience, we'll end it here with this part, that's something you see too, right? Where the abusers force the people they're abusing to also engage in abuse. So it's not only just the women in this case, but also the children.
Well, and we saw this, right, with Maria's whole stance in court, which was, I was under duress and I was in a situation against my will and I was forced to do these things. And we cannot underestimate the power of manipulation, and grooming is a perverse form of manipulating an individual in order to get sexual satisfaction from either watching events take place or participating in events themselves with minors. And there are too many victims to count in this case. And by far, the most important thing that we can come away with this is that the courage and the bravery of these children to stand up, to speak out, that young 16-year-old male who spoke up to their coworker and got out of there, and then was able not just to protect himself, but to then protect the others in the household, is to be commended.
I say this a lot, but I'm going to say it again. First of all, David Calhoun is where he belongs. Should never be let out. He will never be let out. We know the conclusion for Maria. We will see what happens with Ashley. But I know I say this a lot. Our thoughts and our prayers go out to the victims we cover in these cases. But for these children especially, I mean, I hope they can recover both physically and emotionally and mentally and psychologically from this, because again, it is the worst abuse I have ever seen and I have ever reported on. But as you said, Anna, it's such an important topic. It's important that people and educators and those around people can recognize when there's an issue. And this shouldn't have gone on for such a long time, but unfortunately it did. Anna Sonoda, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it, as always.
Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.